Welcome, everyone, to the Most Notorious Podcast. I am Eric Rivenes. As always, thank you so much for hitting the play button. In this episode, we delve into the fascinating and controversial history of absinthe, a spirit often romanticized in literature and art. However, I do recognize that discussions around alcohol can be triggering for some listeners, particularly those who struggle with alcohol addiction. I encourage anyone who may find this topic difficult to prioritize their well-being and listen mindfully. All right, away we go. I am so pleased to introduce Evan Rail to the show today. He is a food and drink writer whose articles have appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Food and Wine, and Vine Pair, where he has a monthly column. His essay, Why Beer Matters, was an Amazon Top 100 bestseller, which he followed with The Brewery in the Bohemian Forest, an award-winning memoir. His brand new book, out on October 15th, is called The Absinthe Forger, a true story of deception, betrayal, and the world's most dangerous spirit. So glad to have you. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So this is morning for you as we're recording this interview. I assume you don't have a glass of absinthe next to you?
No, not today. I just finished my coffee. There is a way of drinking absinthe that is mixing coffee and absinthe, and that's a really nice morning pick-me-up, and maybe something else as well. It's called a café briquette. It's sort of known in the region where absinthe came from, in Western Switzerland. People have a regular espresso coffee and just drop a little bit of absinthe in there for flavoring. But unfortunately, I'm not doing that today.
So I will admit I have never tasted absinthe before. I don't think anyway. I'd imagine I would remember if I had. Do you remember your first experience drinking it? Did you receive the requisite warnings from friends or family?
I guess I would say the thing about absinthe is that most people, once you drink it, don't remember much at all, and so I can't say I remember my first experience with it. That would have been 25 years ago, maybe. But I did get the warnings, and I do think there is something special about the spirit. I'm a food and drink writer. I write about whiskey. I'm a beer guy at heart, but there's no other spirit. There's no other drink in the world with that much mystique, mythos, and romance around it. It is a really special drink. It's a special spirit, and I think it's interesting that there are warnings that go around it. People think of it as a hallucinogen or that it causes madness. It's a really strange drink if you think about it culturally, where it fits into our society and how we relate to it.
Right. So would you describe absinthe for us? What does it taste like?
Right. Well, absinthe is a spirit. It's sometimes thought of as a liqueur, but liqueurs are sweetened, and absinthe itself really isn't sweetened, or if it is, just to a small degree. It's generally pretty clear or yellowish green. Can be perfectly clear, like gin, in one of the variations of the recipes. It's a lot like ouzo, or if you've been to the south of France, pastis, which actually descended from absinthe when absinthe was banned. It's a licorice or anise flavored spirit. And one of the neat things about it is that it's clear, even if it has a yellowish greenish hue, but it's mixed with water. And when you add the water, it has this effect known as a louche. The louche effect is a French word. And the louche is a cloudiness that appears. So you have this clear spirit, this thing you can see through, and you add a few drops of water, And the water is generally added drop by drop very slowly. And it creates this first a very faint and then a growing cloud, like a ghost, like a fog in the glass. And eventually it just becomes perfectly white. It's an emulsion. It's a mixture of the oils with the water. So basically like a salad dressing, but it's just a drink. And the drink itself is sort of, I think of it as minty, very minty. And even sometimes there are forms of mint that are used in it, but it's distilled from three principal herbs, and then other herbs are added. The taste is licorice, black licorice, mint, maybe sort of cinnamon spice. There are sometimes other herbs in there, but it tastes a lot like ouzo or pastis or raki or sambuca or any of the other anise flavored spirits out there that people probably know from maybe some kind of thing your grandmother or grandfather drinks. Some old fashioned spirits, because it definitely is old fashioned. It came about at the end of the 18th century, and it became wildly popular during the 19th century, especially in France, in Gay Paris and the Moulin Rouge era of French culture.
It's often consumed with a sugar cube, correct?
Yes, that's one of the traditional ways of serving it or drinking it. There are these slotted spoons that can be decorated. They're very beautiful because this is, remember, the end of the 19th century in France. It's the Impressionistic era, or the Impressionist era. It's the Belle Époque, Gay Paris. So the spoons are often decorated with Art Nouveau leaves or imprints or some kind of wonderful decoration or engraving. But the spoons are meant to hold a sugar cube, and then the water is dripped through the sugar cube and the slotted spoon into the absinthe to create that louche effect. Now, personally, I don't drink it with sugar. I am a little bit more of a purist, but I do drink it usually with water.
Interesting, yeah. So you talked a bit about its origins. Who was or who were the first to make absinthe? And can you share with us the basic process of distilling it?
Well, it is named after the principal herb, which is wormwood, and it gets its name absinthe from the Latin name for wormwood, although it is flavored with anise and fennel. Generally, there are three herbs. They're called the Holy Trinity. But it got its origin as an extract of wormwood solely around 1760, somewhere in there, 1750. And this would have been a medicine. This would have been used as a treatment because Europeans like to use herbs as a treatment. European pharmacies are always stocked with all these teas, herbal teas, and things like that. The way Americans, we tend to have a bunch of pills in our pharmacies. They tend to have herbal teas. And this would have been one of the earliest forms of absinthe. Would have been just a distillate concentration of the essential oils from wormwood, although it was being mixed with anise around the same time. For a long time, we have thought that the person who invented absinthe was a strange character with a wonderful name, Dr. Pierre Ordinaire. It's just magical. It rolls off your tongue. Pierre Ordinaire, Dr. Pierre Ordinaire. Like the ordinary Pierre, who was a doctor in this part of Western Switzerland known as the Val de Travers, the Travers Valley. The Val de Travers is just around Neuchâtel, and it pokes out. It's one of the parts of Switzerland that pokes into France, the far northwestern edge of Switzerland. And Pierre Ordinaire has taken credit or has been given credit for inventing absinthe around 1780 or 1790, something like that. But researchers have gone through the archives and poured through historical documents, and they've made it clear that somebody was distilling absinthe in the Val de Travers before Pierre Ordinaire, and that was a Madame Henriot. Her name starts with an H, Henriade, if you wanted to pronounce it phonetically or as it's written. And Madame Henriot was a Swiss woman. So yet again, we have an example of a woman inventing something and a man taking credit, which we have plenty of other examples of. But in this case, Madame Henriot is being given the credit she deserves for having been the first person, probably, as far as we can tell, to distill absinthe as a medicine in Switzerland.
Wormwood contains neurotoxins, right?
Yeah, it definitely does. So the neurotoxin that's in it is called thujone. It's an alkaloid and a terpene and a ketone. It's a combination of chemicals that are classified in these different ways. And if you ask me to define what those words mean, I don't know. but but it is one of those things. It's a volatile essential oil that has basically it's a really nice aroma. It's an intense oil that has a really nice aroma. But thujone, this chemical compound, is a neurotoxin. It definitely does. It's not the kind of thing you'd want to have in large quantities, and it is present in absinthe. That is why absinthe was banned. Interestingly enough, absinthe was banned in France in 1914, 1915, sort of in stages. We could just say 1915 permanently for about a century. But the United States banned absinthe in 1912. That's before Prohibition. The United States moved to ban absinthe, just absinthe, when we could still drink whiskey, rum, gin, wine, everything else. We banned absinthe before Prohibition because of thujone, because it was recognized as dangerous at the time.
So, throughout the 19th century, absinthe was sipped and celebrated by some really well known figures, right?
Oh, my favorite figures. It's some of the greatest writers, greatest poets, and the greatest painters of all time, and especially of the 19th century in France, where culture is just at its high point. You've got Baudelaire, you've got Verlaine and Rimbaud, you've got Van Gogh, and a few years later you get Picasso and Oscar Wilde, all there drinking absinthe. And they loved it. They absolutely loved the drink. There are wonderful quotes from them about it. It's clear that it was part of their lives. And especially in the paintings of the Impressionists, it shows up as an image. They use a glass as a prop quite often. Degas, Monet, Manet, Van Gogh, all painted glasses of absinthe, absinthe drinkers, people in cafes with glasses of absinthe. These wonderful impressionistic paintings that really give you a sense of sort of motion, but also a sense of maybe something a little bit decadent. And that's one of the words that was used to describe the writers of that era. They were considered decadent. They were a little bit, I think you have to say, a little bit dangerous. They weren't the kind of people you would want to watch your pets or water your plants while you were out of town, because they would probably burn down your house.
Is the fact that it was considered to be dangerous to drink, was that the attraction?
I don't know if I think it was dangerous people who were drinking it who made it seem dangerous, maybe, because I think some of those poets, Baudelaire, Rimbaud, Arthur Rimbaud or Arthur Rimbaud in French, they were a little bit unpleasant, maybe sometimes. There are wonderful stories about Baudelaire insulting people's babies, in public, and Rimbaud and Verlaine got in a fight in Belgium, and Verlaine shot Rimbaud through the hand with a gun. They were
Wow.
causing problems and creating disturbances and writing poems that you couldn't really print in a family newspaper today. Sort of a little bit pushing the envelope on what was acceptable social behavior. And absinthe was their drink of choice, but I don't think it was the absinthe that caused them to behave or misbehave in that way. I think it was a drink that went along with that sort of behavior. That sort of, who cares what the rules are? I do what I want. At the same time, absinthe was the drink of the upper classes. It became very popular, very fashionable, not just in the sort of Moulin Rouge cabaret settings, but rich people on the very fancy cafes would take a break at the end of the day for what they called l'heure verte, the green hour, and they would stop at 5 p.m. and have absinthe. It was celebrated. Everyone knew what the green hour was. The green hour is the hour when you sit down to have this drink, which is mostly greenish yellow, and you stop for a moment of reflection. The drink itself, I think, actually lends itself to reflection. It inspires a bit of reverie. It's not like every other drink. It's an herbal spirit that stimulates your brain, I would say, and sometimes makes you have nice little short daydreams while you're sipping it.
Yeah, speaking of daydreams or something maybe more intense, when did people first begin believing absinthe had hallucinogenic properties? Could you talk about that and maybe some of the more outrageous claims connected to it?
Oh yeah, they were widely promoted. These claims that absinthe is they just said absinthe it's death. Absinthe makes you go crazy. Absinthe will cause crime. It was a moral panic. We have moral panics nowadays. We know what they're like when we fixate on some kind of thing. Breakdancing in the 1980s or switchblades in the 1950s. Zoot suits at the end of the 1940s, where we suddenly think that this one thing is causing societal problems. And generally, it's not. Of course, when in a moral panic, it's just a group of people hysterically pointing fingers and trying to find someone to blame. But absinthe was being promoted, or rather blamed, for criminality and madness and hallucinations and indeed some really serious crimes, which actually did happen. Oh, at least by the 1870s, mid 1880s, you're starting to see a bunch of newspapers in France and elsewhere saying that absinthe, it means death, or absinthe, it makes you go crazy.
But in reality, right, it was very likely just the overconsumption of alcohol in general that caused some to act the way they did.
Right. We can look at the reports of the time and we can see that the French were consuming vast amounts of alcohol and increasing amounts of alcohol from year to year. The consumption of absinthe went up 15 times, that is 1,500% over the course of about 25 years at the end of the 19th century, 1880, 1890, it was just booming. And people were drinking quite a lot of absinthe, but they were drinking other alcohols as well. The problem, I think, one of the reasons that absinthe was demonized is that it was too popular. And a lot of producers were taking shortcuts, and some unscrupulous producers, not the great brands that we know like Pernod and so forth, but there were producers who were making a spirit that wasn't well made, that did have some toxins in it, that was quickly distilled. We're talking about moonshine, effectively, with some herbs in it, and they were calling it absinthe. It was so popular that people were trying to get it everywhere. And the poor people, of whom there were more and more as the 19th century progressed in France, the economy was not doing so great. They were being sold bad absinthe. They were being sold absinthe that was rot gut, that would legitimately poison you. And it wasn't because of the herbs in it. It wasn't because of the thujone. It was because it was bad liquor. It was moonshine.
You talked about artists, celebrities, members of the upper class enjoying absinthe. There is an illustration of a French soldier happily carrying a bottle of absinthe in your book. So it was enjoyed by many different classes of society.
Indeed, and the French had a bunch of colonial misadventures. They had colonies in northern Africa and around elsewhere, but primarily in Algeria, what's now Algeria. And soldiers who were sent abroad were often given wormwood spirits to cure malaria and other illnesses. So when these soldiers were coming back in 1860, 1870, 1880 from these colonies abroad, they had a taste for absinthe. They knew what it was from being given absinthe as a medicine, and they knew they kind of had an affinity for it. So it was consumed by all of these returning soldiers. It was popular partly because they knew what it was, and it was this new fashionable drink. But it definitely had a connection to the army, the French army, and its years abroad in the colonies.
Yeah, yeah. It was a French psychiatrist, right, at the end of the 19th century who began testing the effects of absinthe. Would you tell us more about him, his experiments, and his conclusions?
Well, this was the chief medical officer, the director of the main psychiatric hospital in Paris. His name was Dr. Valentin Magnan, or Magnan. And he was doing a lot of research on the people who were being admitted to the hospital. And he was also concerned, as were a lot of people in the French upper class, about the decline of French society, the decline of French civilization. We used to be great. We had an empire 50 or 60 years ago under Napoleon, or at this point, maybe 70 years ago under Napoleon. And they were thinking, this is, we're losing wars. We don't have an empire anymore. And I see all these people drinking, and it's clearly society is falling apart. And he decided that the cause of society falling apart was not alcoholism, but absinthism. He created a new disease, or the name for a new disease. He identified a new disease that I think he largely made up. Absinthism isn't true. It's alcoholism, of course, but he was admitting patients and saying, "Oh, see, this guy is twitching, or this guy he's delusional. It must be absinthe." And he focused on absinthe as the cause of the disease. At that time, the chemical compound, the thujone, had been identified, and he started getting wormwood extract, large amounts of wormwood extract and thujone, and applying it to animals, testing on animals in ways that we would just simply say were outrageously cruel by the standards of today. And even they were seen as outrageously cruel by the standards of the 19th century. When this doctor went to the UK, went to England to give a presentation on absinthe and thujone, he was actually chased out of the country by the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. And he was charged with animal cruelty, which was a crime at the time, for his animal testing.
So, despite the doctor being run out of town on a rail, are his findings well received in general? His methods, of course, are despicable, but are his warnings about absinthe effective?
Yeah, there's a growing anti-absinthe movement in France. It's largely funded by the wine industry that wanted to get its customers back, customers who had switched over to drinking absinthe. So they're trying to say, they put up advertisements, they had marches and protests saying, yes to wine, no to absinthe. And they were really pushing this heavily with a sense of nationalistic pride. And that was all sort of static. And then there were some serious crimes. There was one in particular in Switzerland that gave them a lot of fuel to claim that absinthe caused madness and criminality, crimes.
Yes, I definitely want to ask you about that. The Launfray murders happened on August 28th, 1905.
Yes.
Would you tell us what happened that day and what role, if any, absinthe played in the tragedy?
Absinthe had been associated with ne'er-do-wells for quite a while. Poets, bad people, painters and writers, people who had questionable ethics and maybe bad morals. And society was looking down on absinthe, or trying to promote wine instead of absinthe as a more traditional French drink, a drink of, if you could say, moderation. But once the Launfray murders happened, it gave them a lot of fuel to say, see, absinthe causes crime. What happened was that a Swiss farmer named Jean Launfray murdered his wife. He shot her. He grabbed his service rifle from his time in the army. He shot his wife. They got in an argument. He shot her. He shot his infant daughter and his slightly older daughter. And then he tried to shoot himself. So it was a horrible murder-suicide. Unfortunately, he failed in the suicide. And he shot himself through the jaw, I believe, but did not kill himself. He was arrested and tried for the murder of his wife and two daughters. And the day that he shot his wife, he had consumed some absinthe. He had been drinking absinthe. So people were really quick to point out that this crime was caused by absinthe. But what they didn't point out was that he had consumed roughly 4 bottles, I believe, of red wine, a bunch of cognac, and also some absinthe. So the absinthe in the list of the things he consumed is by far the smallest portion of the alcohol he consumed the day he committed the murders. The amount of wine he consumed would have put any of us out, But the murders were blamed on the absinthe. They didn't mention the wine and the cognac he drank before he killed his family. And this was a case that shocked Europe. Indeed, it shocked the entire world. There were headlines all over the world about the Lautrecq murders. People were watching it. It was like the O.J. Simpson trial or some huge criminal trial that was basically public entertainment for many months. And it was something that caught everyone's attention. It was hyped. It was the great news story of those years.
And it was so sensational, right? That it did as much to influence the ban of absinthe as anything did.
Oh, for sure. People were convinced. They could say, "Look, you've got evidence right there. This guy drank absinthe and he killed his family. We got to ban this drink." And so it was extremely sensationalized. It was hyped up. People wanted to talk about the gruesome details. How young was the little girl who was murdered, or the two little girls who were murdered, and why did he fight with his wife? What was oh my? So it was something that really was the sort of the last straw in trying to make this case that absinthe was bad for society, and it pushed it over the edge. There had been a movement growing in a bunch of countries, but in Switzerland, the homeland of absinthe, where absinthe was invented and remains to this day a very popular drink, it was put to a local vote, or rather, it was initially a local vote, but it doesn't matter. It was put to a national vote in 1908, I believe, and the ban went through. It was voted by the Swiss Confederation as something that they would ban throughout their country, and that went into effect in 1910. Then the United States banned absinthe in 1912. Other countries were following around the same time, and finally it ended as a ban in France in 1914, temporarily as the war started, and then it became a permanent ban in 1915.
But just because it's banned, as we, of course, learned from our American prohibition, that doesn't stop people from making it or drinking it.
It doesn't. No, there are lots of examples of that, and I think even you can find people making it. YouTube videos of people trying to make absinthe nowadays. But certainly in its homeland, it became a very popular underground, clandestine drink that people could make. Interestingly enough, because while absinthe itself was banned, the ingredients that go into absinthe were not banned. You could buy them publicly. You can buy wormwood, you can buy alcohol, you can buy anise, and you can buy fennel. You can buy all of the other herbs that create the intricate aromas and flavors. Those are all legal. Everything's legal. It's just if you put them in the same glass, if you put them into a still, if you mix them together in any way, then it's illegal. And people in Switzerland were making absinthe throughout the prohibition on absinthe. For 95 years there, they were making it underground as bootleggers in a very romantic story, a hysterical story. They were basically rum runners of a kind, bootleggers, moonshiners who were making their own absinthes, which actually led to the development of new recipes and new flavors in absinthe, interestingly.
That is interesting. Yeah. So the ban lasted for decades over the course of most of the 20th century across the globe. What was it that ultimately changed people's minds about the dangers of absinthe?
Well, the important thing to remember is it wasn't banned in every country. It was banned in almost every country. And there were a couple of notable exceptions. Spain, for a while, in the Spanish Republic, those years, actually more than that, from roughly just before World War II through the late 60s, was still making absinthe. And they make absinthe today. They call it absenta. But Spain was legalized, but that isn't what caused its legalization. It was never banned in Czechoslovakia, as a new country that emerged in 1918. And then in the Czech Republic, which is where I live today, it was never banned. So after the Velvet Revolution in 1989, Czech producers, Czech distillers who were making things like Slivovitz, making their own little versions of rum, they realized, hey, it's an interesting spirit is absinthe, and it's never been banned. It's not illegal here, so we're going to start making it. So sometime in the mid-90s, around 93 or so, Czech producers started making absinthe. And as the world was opening up toward Eastern Europe, and people from the West were traveling toward Eastern Europe, or Central Europe, if you want to call it that, people were starting to become familiar with Czech absinthe. And one person in particular, a British importer of Czech beer, realized that legally he could import Czech absinthe to the UK, just as he had been importing Czech beer through the EU regulations that were coming into effect. Remember, at that time, the UK was part of the EU, and the Czech Republic was a candidate country, which meant it was following all of the same rules, and all of the rules applied to it. So one of these importers of Czech beer, a world in which I am very familiar, started trying to import Czech absinthe in the 1990s, late 1990s. I was already drinking it at the time in Prague before it was available in the UK. But he succeeded. He got the British authorities to realize that, yes, under EU laws of reciprocity, if something is legal in the Czech Republic, it is legal to sell here in the UK. So sure, you can bring it in. So they started bringing it in. And in early 1999, these British importers of Czech absinthe started having these wonderful parties in London. It became this huge sensation. It couldn't be made in France. It couldn't be legally made in Switzerland or sold. It couldn't be made or sold in any of these countries that had banned it. But the UK had figured out how to get it there. And it was still illegal in the United States, although I have to confess, it was illegal in the United States, but I was bringing back many bottles as I traveled back and forth from the Czech Republic, where I'd made my home, to California, where I'm from. Often had a bottle in my backpack and just kind of walk it through. And other people were doing that too. There was a nice gray market because although it had been banned for over 90 years or so, about 90 years in the United States at that time, it wasn't so serious. We had an epidemic of drugs and so forth. This is an alcoholic beverage. It's romantic. It's associated with writers and painters. So I think the most you could get if you got caught with it was probably a slap on the wrist or, being told not to do that again. I never got caught. I just brought it in my checked luggage whenever I came home. And I know bartenders in cities like San Francisco, in New Orleans especially, in New York, Chicago, Portland, they were actually, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, serving absinthe at the time in this sort of gray market era. And it was largely Czech absinthe where it was still legal to produce it.
So how much wormwood does someone have to consume in order to negatively affect them?
Yeah, it's well known. I mean, these things have been studied. So there are lethal dose calculations and so forth on wormwood, actually on thujone, the terpene that I talked about that causes problems. It's a neurotoxin for sure. There is a hard limit on thujone in absinthe nowadays. In the EU, it's 35 milligrams per liter. If you think about how much vitamin C you take, maybe 500 milligrams. So, 35 milligrams of thujone is not very much. There have been analyses of historic absinthe from before the ban, which we call pre-bans. Those are the sought out bottles that people are always trying to find. They've done analysis of a pre-ban bottle and it had the same amount of thujone. There's no difference really in terms of how it's made and in terms of the thujone level. Some of them might have had a little bit higher, but in general, the modern absinthe, which has a high limit of 35 milligrams per liter, is exactly like the average absinthe before that. To have a lethal dosage, it's more than multiple bottles of absinthe would contain nowadays. And fortunately, there's a nice little trick. One of the medical treatments for absinthe poisoning, that is thujone poisoning, is ethyl alcohol. It is alcohol itself. It's booze, which actually allows your body to process the thujone. So if you're drinking absinthe, you kind of are preventing yourself from being poisoned with thujone simply because the drink has absinthe in it. You need to be drinking pure thujone. And if you did, when you went to the hospital, they would effectively give you alcohol as a treatment. They would give you alcohol as a treatment. It's pretty funny.
Wow. Huh. So much of your book is the history of the drink, the world's most dangerous spirit, as you state in your title. But there's also this story, which happens much more recently, of a man who takes advantage of those eager to buy bottles of absinthe, specifically pre-ban bottles. Would you tell us more about pre-ban absinthe, the market for it, and why some people are so enamored with it?
Well, absinthe had a lot of mystique around it in its heyday before it was banned, but banning it just made it more romantic and more mythic. People wanted to know about this thing. Think about it. There's been no other spirit in the history of the world, a particular spirit that was banned. We had prohibition in the United States. That was spirits, wine, beer, largely banned, almost everything, right? But we didn't actually just ban one spirit like rum or something like that. We banned absinthe before prohibition, and then that stood. And in this case, in Europe, the ban, or globally, the ban on absinthe really contributed to this mythos, this romance around the spirit. So it's unique in that it has a cutoff date. For a long time, it had a cutoff date of 1914, 1915. There just wasn't any produced, not commercially, that was available other than here and there, little oddball examples. And that led to this collector community of absinteurs, these absinthe fans, aficionados, if you will. There's a secret underground world of absinthe collectors that you and I are not really part of. And I have friends in that community. I've been to the parties. They let me into the clubhouse, if you will. But for most of us, the door is closed, and it is all done sub rosa. They trade absinthe. They talk about where to find bottles, and they're tracking down these historic bottles from before 1915, from before the ban, these what they call pre-bans, and drinking them. They're largely drinking them and sharing them. These are, in a way, it's bizarre. These are museum pieces. They aren't making any more of the pre-bans. Those are gone. Time moves in one direction, and the amount of pre-bans in the world is a finite number. But these people, these collectors, the so-called absinteurs, are tracking down bottles, and they're very clever, sharing them with each other in these secret sessions, a rendezvous. They would meet at a chalet in the Alps and open a bottle by candlelight, or trade them basically on the sly. They've been doing this for years, since before absinthe was made legal again in the United States, since before it was made legal again in Europe. They've been collecting these old bottles and opening them and drinking them at parties or alone. And it's a really magical experience if you think about it, because you're drinking something from 100 years ago that it's not just the same kind of drink that Picasso drank or Van Gogh drank. It's the same spirit, it's the same brand, it's the same batch that they were drinking. You can open a bottle from 1870 and drink something that might have been drunk by one of your artistic or literary heroes.
Right, right. Another very interesting aspect to this is about the taste of the drink that develops over time. In a freshly distilled bottle of absinthe, you write you can taste the ingredients individually, the anise, the fennel, but as it sits, as it ages, it combines into a flavor that is really unique.
Yeah, I tend to write about time a lot, and I've written about it in some of my beer books about beer's relationship to time and wine's relationship to time. But in the Absinthe Forger, in this new book, it's a particular case because there is a hard cutoff at 1915, and you're tasting something when you taste a pre-ban like these guys in the Absinthe Forger that I describe, these collectors. You're tasting something that your hero was drinking 130 years ago, but you're tasting it with 130 years of age on it. And you're trying to think, is this what they tasted or is this what I'm tasting? And when producers nowadays, modern producers like to recreate historic recipes, but they can't recreate 130 years of aging. They can try. There are little shortcuts. They know things that they can do. But the process is largely as happens with time. Just simply that over the years, some of these chemical compounds dissipate. Some of the flavors that we like in drinks of any kind go away. Other ones actually develop. There are chemical compounds that sort of reform. There are things that happen in the bottle in terms of aging that change the taste of this spirit. It happens to wine and whiskey as well. Now, the idea is that drinks don't really age in the bottle, or at least spirits don't age in the bottle, but we can prove it in a laboratory. We can show that chemical compounds that are present when you bottle it dissipate over time, and the other ones develop and grow as these things sort of remix in the bottle. So it is an interesting idea that when you're tasting something, is it an old absinthe? Is it a modern absinthe? I can tell you that when you taste those pre-bans, when you're drinking absinthe from 130 years ago, they have something special to them. They are remarkable.
And again, as you've said, you've had a chance to taste a few. And you write about some of your experiences as part of your investigation into the Absinthe Forger, these experiences tasting some of these exotic spirits. And they were truly once in a lifetime experiences for you.
Yeah, I think every one of those spirits is a once in a lifetime experience because once you drink it, it's gone. When you're talking about pre-bans, for me, drinking these old spirits, and we opened a with one collector, we opened a bottle of rum from I don't know 1880 or something like that, Jamaica rum as well, because he has multiple types of spirits in his cellar, and you're drinking something that old. It is if you think about what you're doing, you know, if you're aware of what's going on, you think, I'm never going to do this again. You know, no one's going to open this bottle again. Once you open the bottle, that only happens once. The first time you open it, you break the seal, and then tasting it. I'm lucky enough at writing about food and drink. I get to taste nice things sometimes and go to great restaurants sometimes for work. But those kind of experiences pale in comparison to drinking the pre-bans or just the old spirits in general. It is something that makes me stop and think a lot about where I am and have a sense of presence. Now it's weird, alcohol doesn't normally lend itself to mindfulness, but in that case, I would actually say it is a sense of mindfulness and even gratitude that you can reach out and touch history in that way.
There are collectors who don't open their bottles. They like them historically intact.
Yeah, that's actually probably how the Absinthe Forger himself got away with his crimes for so long, because he was selling counterfeit, we believe counterfeit forged. I mean, it's been proven absinthe, counterfeit historical bottles, vintage bottles, or counterfeit pre-bans to these collectors who then would not open them. And one of the ways he got caught is that a really great taster was given a sample, and he knew that it was fake. This guy, Scott McDonald's, fantastic taster, wonderful palate, and didn't even blink. He just tasted something. He said, "No, that's not a pre-ban. I know exactly what that is." He identified the other spirits that were in the bottle. But by and large, a lot of these collectors think of the bottles, these pre-bans, real or fake, as art pieces, as sort of mementos, and they don't want to open it because that would sort of ruin it. Now, it has to be said, the absinthe community has a huge obsession with absinthe antiques, and it is a world like no other. The absinthe posters from the 19th century, the Belle Epoque era or the Moulin Rouge era, are wildly beautiful Art Nouveau masterpieces. There are glasses, there are mirrors, there are spoons, there are little matchstick holders. There are all kinds of things to collect that are unbelievably beautiful antiques. So for a lot of the absinthe bottle collectors, the bottles are just another antique. They fit in with their spoon collection, or they go alongside the posters that they have from 1890 that say you should drink oxygene absinthe or something like that. But by selling bottles, counterfeit bottles, to these collectors, the Absinthe Forger kind of protected himself because he knew no one was going to, or at least some of these collectors weren't going to open the bottle to let the spirit out of the bottle, if you will, the genie out of the bottle, that would prove that the spirit inside was fake.
Right, right. It's kind of brilliant because it is a consumable forgery. And not only is the drinker drinking the evidence, but even though it might not taste quite right, might not live up to their expectations. Often they either don't want to admit that they have been fooled, or perhaps they have convinced themselves that it was better than it actually was.
Yeah, there's a lot of psychology in this book. The psychology of the absinthe forger himself, the psychology of the collectors who were buying the bottles and who were being ripped off by a fraudster. But because of how psychology works, they didn't want to believe it, that they could possibly be ripped off by someone who, remember, this is one of their friends. This is a story of betrayal. This is someone who ripped off people who knew him for years, people who traveled with him, people who ate meals with him, who shared hotel rooms with him, who were part of this secret underground community of absinthe collectors. And the psychology of it meant that it was just really hard to believe that you could have been duped by this absinthe forger. Now, he's not a forger. He's one of the world's greatest authorities on absinthe. He's a man with impeccable taste. He knows everything. No, I must just be wrong. This is definitely real. So the psychology goes a long ways. And a good part of the book is actually wondering or even asking people about the psychology behind the betrayals. That is, why did the absinthe forger himself do this to his friends, to people who loved him?
Right, yeah. There's this mystique, right, that centers around this mysterious cache of pre-banned bottles, right?
Yeah, there's a secret stash of absinthe bottles they're all pre-bans that were surfacing in the 2010s, 2013, 14, 15 years. And they're from a palazzo in Italy. It's not known where. There's a good idea that it's in Venice. The story is that it's a former hotel that's in Venice that has a cellar that's actually under the water line. So it's going to be temperature regulated, but it's down in the bottom of a palazzo. And these palazzo bottles were coming up in the absinthe collector community. Now, when I talked about this to other spirits aficionados, even writers, nobody had heard of these palazzo bottles. And that's because the absinthe collector community really is sub rosa. It's underground. But these palazzo absinthe bottles were circulating in the absinthe community. They were pre-banned, clearly pre-banned Pernod, but there were some other associated bottles. It appears that the palazzo from which they were coming was a hotel that had been frequented by artists, because many of the bottles have decorations on them, paintings or self-portraits, little caricatures, the kind of thing that someone like Picasso might do on a napkin, and then they'd slap it on a bottle. It wasn't Picasso, but it was some very famous artists who have decorated some of these bottles. And collectors were buying these bottles for not very much money, because it was all sub rosa and it was among friends. I know you, give me just an X amount of money, maybe a few $100s, a few $1,000s, whatever, for a pre-banned Pernod that's in a unmarked bottle decorated with a cartoon that appears to be drawn by a famous German expressionist painter. It was a really wild story, and then it disappeared, and the palazzo bottles went away, except they didn't. They appear to be. Some people are telling me they're still around. There's a lot of them, but they're more underground than they were.
So what is the going rate on a bottle of one of these vintage pre-ban, or even a share of a bottle? Can you explain how that works?
The going rate at the time, I'm not sure about the market now because of the harm that was done by the absinthe forger. That's largely, the market's a little bit in flux. People haven't recovered. There's not a lot of trust. Now, trust is a big issue in a collector community and in any community. So nowadays, let's just say the market's on hold for now because you can't really say. But at the time, people were paying $3,000, $4,000, $5,000, $6,000 for a bottle. That's a lot of money for most of us for a single bottle. A bottle has 15, 20 shots in it, depending on how much evaporation has happened, right? Because these bottles are so old, the level of the spirit is not all the way up in the neck, it's down in the shoulder. It has evaporated down. So maybe there are 15 shares in a bottle. And that's one way that these bottles were able to circulate in the collector community. An individual might buy a bottle if they were feeling wealthy, but a lot of people sometimes pooled their money. So you could get 15 people together to buy a bottle, and everybody puts in $200 or $300, and then you can buy the bottle for $3,000 or $4,000, and then everybody has one special drink. And that's not so bad if maybe it's New Year's Eve, maybe it's your birthday, and you can have a drink that costs $200 or $300. I mean, a single glass. But you got yours in a little sample bottle, a little shot bottle, like a little mini bottle of liquor that you might get on a plane. But it looks more like a pharmaceutical bottle, and they would be labeled and hand labeled, or maybe with a typewriter. It would say Pernod 1910, or it would say Junot, or it would say in one of the other brands, Premier Fils was one that I got to taste. That's a pre-ban. So you might be able to buy a Premier Fils, just a share, just a bottle, a shot-sized bottle. And yeah, it's a really special drink, and that's a way to get everybody into the bottle, as it were, and have it not just go to one person.
Right. Can you talk a bit about the different ways bottles of absinthe are faked, forged?
Well, for people who know, I think there are a lot of signs. Collectors are super nerdy, and they know exactly where things like labels are supposed to be placed, the height of the placement on the label, the shape of the color of the cork, the shape of the bottle, etc. But there's something that's kind of special about the collector community as well, and in these old bottles, in their character. The bottles are all unique. They're 130 years old or 120 years old. They all have noticeable marks on them, chips or hairline cracks or just discoloration that can be noted and that show up in photographs. So it's a way to identify a bottle. You can tell by the little flaws in it if you look carefully. And each one is unique. It's like a fingerprint, basically. So that's one aspect of it. The other is that there are hard things to fake in a bottle. Now you can buy an empty bottle of absinthe, a pre-ban absinthe, for maybe $50 or $100. You can buy a label for $5 or $10. You can buy the wax. You can just get modern wax. You can buy a stamp to make the stamp or make your own. But the cork is really hard to fake. Old corks, you don't buy old corks in junk shops or on eBay. Those don't exist. Old corks fall apart. And vintage absinthe bottles, real pre-bans, have falling apart corks in them. But when you make a new one, you don't have a falling apart cork to put into it. So you generally have to use a modern cork that you kind of age, make it look like it's old when you put it in there. That said, there are just lots of parts of the bottle that are easy to identify as real or authentic if you're a connoisseur. If you're a collector, you know everything about these bottles. And this label is, 2 inches up from the bottom, but in 1910 they were placing the labels a half inch up from the bottle. So that's going to be fake. There are things like that, those details that these collectors know intimately, would be lost on you or me, but it's something that helped them identify the forgeries that were circulating back in the day.
Right, yeah. So I know you want to keep some of this story a surprise for readers, but would you mind giving us just a gist of your investigation into this character you call Christian?
Well, the most interesting, strangest thing for me is that when people told me there was an absinthe forger, who had made these counterfeits, I said, "Who was it?" And they named him, the person I call Christian. And I said, "That guy," because I'd met him. We were Facebook friends. I had DM'd him, but I'd met him in real life. I'd shared absinthe with him at a little secret soiree up in the Alps once. So I actually knew who this person was. And I wrote to him and I said, "Hey, I'd like to, I'm trying to figure out what's going on. I'd like to hear your side of the story." And he blocked me. I don't like being blocked on social media. I'm a nice person. I wasn't asking. I wasn't being rude. I just wanted to know what was going on. And in general, I write about food and drink. I'm used to talking to people who are creative, who make interesting foods and drinks, and who want to talk about what they make. And this was a guy who didn't want to talk. And that seemed wrong to me. That didn't seem that wasn't what I was used to anyway in my work. So it kind of, instead of sending me away, it made me more curious. And I started reaching out to the collectors. There's basically a gang of amateur detectives who tracked this guy down, who proved how these forgeries, proved that they were forgeries, proved that this guy did forge historical absinthe, pre-ban absinthe. And these amateur detectives are spread across Europe. So I had to go back to Switzerland a couple of times. I had to fly over to France, Western France, in Nantes, where one of the greatest collectors, Patrick Roussel, lives. One of the main detectives who proved that the Absinthe Forger was doing these crimes. I had to go to Germany, and I'd travel across the Czech Republic to see a famous distiller there. Martin Jufanek makes wonderful absinthes today. And I basically was tracking this guy down, this guy I knew, and I was collecting the evidence. And the story kind of gets a little bit hairy. Now, I don't want to give too much away, or even ruin the book for anyone. No spoilers here. But I'm a food and drink writer, and I write about people, winemakers and brewers and distillers, chefs and things like that. This book is in true crime. So it is a crime story. It's a true crime story about a very, it's not murder or anything, but it's fraud. And it was a really strange journey for me to take to get closer and closer and closer to understanding this person until, we were as close as you can get, I guess.
Right, yeah. So I've got a question for you, and this may be a question others listening have. For anyone maybe wanting to try absinthe after hearing this podcast or reading your book, is there a brand that you'd recommend maybe as an introduction?
Oh, there are wonderful American makers of absinthe nowadays. There are some great French and Swiss brands that you can find. The best thing to do would be to go to a bar that specializes in it. If you're close to a bar, especially if one that has maybe an absinthe fountain, that's a piece of paraphernalia that's kind of neat. But if they don't have a fountain, that's great too. Any place that has absinthe that serves it or tries to take it seriously. There are a bunch of bars I've spotted as I'm going across the country that are doing it. Among brands, there are numerous. I like La Clandestine, Pernod, which was the great French producer, the largest producer in history, is making absinthe again. There are producers like Lucid and Jade and Vivid. There are brands that you can find maybe in specialty shops that might have a good absinthe. If you're making it at home, just put a small half shot, less than an ounce, in a glass and add extremely cold, good water, still water to it. In a wine glass would work fine. Try to slowly dribble it in to create that louche effect, and then just smell it. Pick up the aroma and complexity of the various fragrant aromas that are there, and then take a sip. If you don't like licorice, you might not like it, black licorice or minty flavors like that, but it's something that's really refreshing. It's really inspirational in terms of making you daydream and stuff like that. It's really nice drink. I would say go to a good bar. Also, you'll find it in certain cocktails, not as the main ingredient, but if you get an improved whiskey cocktail, it's used in there, or a corpse reviver #2. It's used in a small portion, so you can get a sense of what absinthe is, along with a couple of other spirits and mixers. In classic cocktails, if you go to a good cocktail bar, they'll have it. But the best way to drink it, I think, is just mixed with water the way they drink it in the Val de Travers today. It's a fantastic spirit with a lot of character and a huge amount of myth and romance around it.
Ah, very cool. So you have a website, evanrail.com.
Yeah, that's just my online persona. You can find me on Blue Sky and Instagram. I am just a writer, just a normal writer guy who is going around trying to find these interesting stories. And this story, The Absinthe Forger, is the most interesting story I've come across in my career.
Yeah, it's a very entertaining book. So thank you again. I so appreciate you coming on the show.
Glad to, and thank you for fitting me in on the schedule. And it's early in the morning here, but it felt right to talk about this amazing spirit. Thanks for having me on.
Again, I have been speaking to Evan Rail. He is the author of The Absinthe Forger, a true story of deception, betrayal, and the world's most dangerous spirit. This is another episode of the Most Notorious podcast, broadcasting to every dark and cobwebbed corner of the world. I'm Eric Rivenes, and have a safe tomorrow.